I read 60 books in 2022, mostly through listening. I am not a literature major. I probably have no idea what I'm talking about. All of my book notes are on my phone, and to be fair, for some of the books, I was looking at my notes the other day. I don't remember anything about them. That might be the one downside of listening to audiobooks, because if I zoom out for a sec, I just lose track. But for me, it's more important that I keep up with this habit. So excuse me if I don't remember all of the detail. I will give you my rating, and the criteria I use to rate my books is 3 E's. Did the book make me feel educated, entertained, or enchanted? The first book that I read was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V. Schwab. It was quite a long book, but it was kind of a cool one to start off the year. It's essentially a story about a girl making a deal with the devil to live forever, but then people will never remember her. So she could walk into the store, come back out, walk back in again, and nobody would even know who she is. I do find the concept really interesting, and given that was the first book that I read last year, I can still vividly remember some of the scenes. So definitely speaks to the storytelling skills, but I do feel like this book is a little bit too long, and the concept is a little bit too simplistic. If the book is that long, I kind of expect a bit more twists and turns and depth of the concept. So I'm going to rate it a 3. It is a good book. I would probably not read it again though. The next book is Midnight Library by Hagg. It is also a really popular book. Now this is pretty much a self-help book disguised as a novel. It basically portrayed the different kind of lives the protagonist could have lived if she made certain decisions. The takeaway I got was to really focus on living at the moment, focus on the life you have now. It is supposed to reflect the life of someone who suffers from depression. Now, I personally don't, but I still feel like it's almost a too simplistic representation. I'm rating this book a 2. I actually would not recommend it. The next is a classic. It is Misery by Stephen King. So I did read this one. I vividly remember I got the physical version as a Christmas gift, and over MLK weekend, I believe, I spent 2 days just day to night reading through the whole book. It was definitely a page turner. I've seen the movie before I read the book. Both are equally good. His writing is also so nuanced and detailed that it genuinely gave me the chills. I was also really fascinated by how the whole story happened within pretty much one room of one house, and I would 100% read it again in maybe a couple of years. So I'm giving this one a 4. The next book is The Subtle Art of Not Giving a by Mark Manson. So I actually had a dedicated video related to this book, but I took the fashion lessons that I took away from this book. It is a self-help book, and the idea is basically like the title suggests, focusing more on what's important to you, less about how other people see you. For me, it has too many of these obvious lessons because I am already someone who doesn't care too much about what people think of me. There was one concept in the book that I jotted down. It was the desire for a more positive experience is itself a negative experience. And paradoxically, the acceptance of one's negative experience is itself a positive experience. It definitely gives you the idea that be happy where you are, but I do think there is a fine balance between being content and being ambitious in a healthy way. This book for me is a 2 because I feel like I didn't learn all that much. Next book is Pop Song by Larissa Pham. This is pretty much a memoir of her relationship with art, with intimacy. She perceives art from the perspective of the artist and the situation that the artist is in, the artist's life. For example, the pieces from Yayoi Kusama, all of her pieces feel really cheerful. She uses a lot of bright colors, but if you learn a bit about her life story, it is actually quite negative. So it was interesting to obviously understand art from the whole perspective, not just the feeling you get by simply looking at these art pieces. I am not familiar with most of the art that she talks about. I'm sure they're all like really famous, really impressive pieces, but without actually seeing the art pieces and I was just listening to the audiobook, it was just a little bit hard for me to connect with this book. So for that reason, I'm giving this a 2. It is definitely me, not her. Next book is Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. The whole book focuses a lot on being vulnerable. Now this book was written, I don't remember, at least a couple of decades ago, I feel like. So at the time, the concept of being vulnerable might still be quite new. But for now, and maybe because of my personal education, I just don't find any of the concepts she talk about mind-blowing to me. Blaming on the shame culture is kind of just putting a rose-tinted glass on what reality is. She talks a lot about how shame really hurts one's growth. But shame to me doesn't 100% mean a negative thing. I think some healthy amount of shame, maybe it's just a different way to say that being blunt and being just straightforward can actually help with someone's growth. But maybe shame was not defined that way in her book. Overall for me, this is another book that I just don't feel like I learned much, so I'm giving that a 2 as well. The next book is Becoming by Michelle Obama. I never thought that I would enjoy a memoir as much as I did this one. She wrote her memoir in such a humble but also honest way that I could connect with her a little bit more, and it's really interesting to see from a minority's perspective in today's world how she grew up. So even though it was a very long book, I think it was very well written, so I'm going to give it a 4. The next one is another memoir. It's Educated by Tara Westover. This is another really popular one, and it's interesting to get a glimpse into the Mormon survivalist world and how basically her whole family lived off the grid and all of the interactions and the trauma and the negative experiences that she's been through. It also seems like she was lucky in the sense that she was very good at writing. So she managed to get educated and became successful. It didn't really tell me too much about what's that connection between her Mormon survivalist upbringing and how she kind of broke out of that society. But overall, it was a very eye-opening book, and for that reason, I'm giving this a 4 as well. Next one is Dear Girls by Ali Wong, and she also narrated her audiobook, so it definitely just felt like I was listening to her stand-up, which was hilarious. It was very honest writing, and it's basically her life advice for her girls. And I don't remember any lesson from the book. I feel like that said something about how it was probably just very kind of straightforward lessons. Giving this a 3 because I was thoroughly entertained. The next book is When We Cease to Understand the World. This is quite a boring book. It is a book about just scientists and mathematicians and I guess their lives. I mean, honestly, I don't even remember what the book was about. The only concept that did stick with me was how a lot of the mathematicians and scientists think of science more as art. And maybe I'm just not the audience for the book. So given I didn't get entertained, I didn't feel too educated, definitely was not enchanted, I'm giving this book a 2. Then I listened to Malibu Rising by TJR. I don't think it deserves the hype, especially if you're someone like me who's not really interested into the celebrity culture, the Hollywood glam. I know TJR has her own Hollywood-like universe in a bunch of her novels. I did read a few more, but this one for me, I didn't really take away too much from it. If there's any lesson from this book, it'd be like, don't abandon your kids. And for the kids, you don't have to follow your parents' path. I'm giving this a 2. Then I listened to A Walk Around the Block by Spike Carlson. It tells you just random facts about cities from the sewage system to squirrels. So you can learn a little bit of everything, but it's not a systematic way to learn how cities work. Therefore, I'm going to give it a 2. Next is The Princess Saves Herself in This One by Amanda Lovelace. This is a beautiful, sad poetry. Because I was listening to it, I just didn't have enough space to digest and really read the word by word of the poetry, and it was based on her real life stories. So I definitely want to actually read the physical copy, and it was a very beautiful poetry. So I'm going to rate it a 3. Then I listened to How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, another classic self-help. A lot of these books, I feel like they're talking a lot about the common sense, and especially this one, it was originally written in 1936. So a lot of the concepts we've already heard of. He did have a point about how to kind of praise and criticize people, but I feel like the way that he used certain kind of formulas to tell you how to do that contradicts with his other point about you should really put yourself in others' shoes. So let's say if someone prefers really straightforward feedback, then why would you try to kind of sugarcoat it to criticize someone and then praise them after? So I'm going to give it a 2 because I feel like I didn't really learn much, and also I can disagree with some of his opinions. Then I listened to The Famous Atomic Habits by James Clear. This was probably my personal favorite self-help book. It actually did give you step-by-step guide to build a good habit or to break a bad habit. The other thing that stuck to me towards the end of the book is in order to master a habit, you need that habit to be your identity. However, you also need to keep reflecting on your habits and keep improving so that your identity doesn't constrain you from exploring more. I'm giving this book a 4 because I think it was very educational and practical, and I learned a lot. And I listened to The House of Gucci by Sarah Gay Forden. It was hard to believe that it was, basically based on the real story. So what did I learn from the book besides all of the drama? Drama creates attention to a brand, but a brand will never last if you don't have good products or good services. And also the designs and the trends will always evolve. So in order to sustain the brand, you have to keep breaking through. Keep breaking through. Breaking through one time is not enough. It's also why Gucci hired the American designer Tom Ford to run the ready-to-wear and fashion business. I'm giving this book a 3 because I did enjoy the drama and the tension. I do feel like it was a little bit long. Next book was Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. Epic history book. And I do like that he used kind of way of storytelling to basically remind me of what I did learn in high school, but I completely forgot. Do you think that because he wrote this book in a storytelling way, there is the downside of oversimplification and also not really giving different perspectives of certain events that happened in history? And it was quite a big, long book, so I don't even think I digested everything by just listening to it once. So I do want to go back to this book. I'm personally not a big fan of history, so the fact that I could listen through the entire book, I feel like that got me more interested in history. For that reason, I'm going to give this book a 4. The next book is On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. It's kind of reading a very long, beautiful, but sad, intimate poem. It was very nicely written, just not in my preferred style of writing. I feel like it's almost a little bit too flourish, and it's almost too sad of a story that I feel like I need to prepare before I could read it. It's not my personal taste in books. I don't want to sob at all the books that I read. So for that reason, I'm going to give it a 2 because it did give me more of that helpless, desperate vibes. But if you do like a good, sad book, I feel like you would really enjoy this. Speaking of really sad stories, the next one is Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zollner. It was her memoir. She reflected a lot on her relationship with her parents, and maybe it's because I can relate to her cultural background. I feel like I felt a lot more connected to her, and it also made me realize how fragile life is and how much I should really show more appreciation to my parents. I'm giving this book a 3. On a happier note, the next book is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. It was definitely a witty, funny, quirky book. A lot of the lines in this book are so good that I want to pick up the physical book and really digest line by line. So listening to the audiobook is not enough for me, giving this a 3. Then we have A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. It is basically a book about nothing, like basically mundane things in the life of a count over decades. As boring as it sounds, it was a fascinating book, and it had a lot of really cool concepts. I really love the analogy of how he thinks of relationships as buttons in a box. So he has different color buttons and he puts them in different boxes. The story definitely got a bit more exciting towards the end, and I definitely built this affection towards the Count. It was almost bittersweet to finish the novel. It was really moving to see how the Count appreciates everything in life. It was definitely a 4, and I would want to read that book again. The next one is another novel, Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. Now, disclaimer, I'm not into romance novels, and I am rating this novel a 1 because the setting of the Prince of the UK and the first son of the United States, it just feels too unreal in that political setting, and the storyline was really simple. The next one is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This was one of my book club books, another of TJR's masterpiece in many people's opinion, and I definitely did enjoy this book more than Malibu Rising. I am rating this book a 3. Unlike how so many people rave about this book, not into that whole celebrity kind of fame universe, the one line that I really resonated with was, "Life is too short not to be yourself." And I'm pretty sure many people said it in many different ways, but that just really stuck with me. The next book is Conversations with Franz by Sally Rooney. Now, I don't remember what this book was about. I did see on my notes that I rated this a 1. The storyline was a bit simple. It was an interesting concept how they examined friendship, jealousy, just overall relationship, but maybe just the way of writing or the way that the story was told, it just did not stay in my mind. I genuinely do not remember this story at all. The next book is The Vegetarian by Hagg. It's this lady who decided to be vegetarian, but the story is really more about society and different people's perspectives and views. Nobody really understood her and everybody thought she was crazy. It makes me wonder, what is identity and what matters more, whether it's the societal constraints that form your identity, or was it the indescribable, incomprehensive identity that only you can understand? Definitely a fascinating read. I give it a 4. The next book is Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. I tried to listen to this book. I literally wrote down here, I had to start listening for 4 times, but I still couldn't get into it. And I think I did finish listening to the book, but I don't remember anything. I also heard people either love or hate this book, but I feel like I need to pick up the physical book to read it and then form an opinion. So my rating is a question mark for this one. The next book is Recitative by Toni Morrison. It is a short story, more like an experiment on the readers, because the 2 girls in the story, one is white, one is black, but you don't know who's who. And I actually listened to this book 3 times. I did notice myself picking up just stereotypical behavior and descriptions, and thought that one girl was white, the other girl was black, but then I would change my opinion throughout the story. That was the power of the story, is how much just the stereotypical things could very easily form an opinion that very well could be false. I do wish that this story was a little bit longer so I can get more context, but then I also think maybe in that sense it'll be too obvious who's who. So either way, it was a really fascinating read and I would recommend it. I give it a 3. The next book is Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. So this was basically the part 2 or the, I guess, sequel to Sapiens, but this book, instead of focusing on the history, it focuses on the future. It definitely expanded the concept of free will from Sapiens, and it's really doubting free will because you can desire freely, but you don't know why you desire certain things. There was also a lot of focus on organisms being algorithms and how we don't really actually have a single self, and how advanced algorithms can essentially know us better than how we know ourselves. These are all kind of really scary concepts to digest. I've never really read up on these kind of more futuristic concepts, so I did learn a lot from this book, so I'm giving this actually a 5. Next one was a physical book. It was the Chanel Collections and Creations by Danielle Ball, more so on her designs, on how she only made pieces that she really loved and how she made women feel comfortable, and how she always styles her looks with pearls, with camellias. And it was just really great to see all of the pictures and kind of the story behind these designs. I also really recommend the novel Coco Chanel. That novel talked a lot more about Coco Chanel's personal life and her journey, less so about her fashion designs. For this particular book, it's kind of a coffee table book in a sense, so I'm giving this a 3. I did learn something, but I also feel like it's just like a pretty book to look at. Next book is the classic Who Moved My Cheese by Spencer Johnson. It's a very simple short story about change and how we should accept change. Basically, the faster you let go of your own cheese, the quicker you will be able to find new cheese. But I feel like it was, again, a little bit too simplistic. If we're just blindly optimistic about change and just welcome any change that happens, you could also overlook the complexity of a certain change or just the complicated impact of change, and you might have not thought everything through. I don't know if I fully agree with the idea in this book, so for that reason, I am giving this a 2. The next one is the 99% Invisible City by Roman Mars. So this is a book based on the podcast 99% Invisible, compared to A Walk Around the Block, which is also written in a similar way, in the sense that it's kind of a bunch of facts. I do prefer this book because it has a bit more information and it is also a bit more concise in the way that it's written. So if you want to just learn a little bit of everything, if you want to have more trivia knowledge, then it was a good listen. I would definitely go back to this book in the future as well, and I'm rating this a 3. Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. It was a very sad story about the reality of the American dream, and it was written in 1949, I believe, about a salesman who tried to live this perfect life. It made me think about what really matters most in life and how much should happiness be dependent on or defined by the materialistic or superficial pursuits. It is a solid 4 for me. Then I listened to It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover, another internet sensation, shall we say. It did reflect abusive relationships. It made you think about what and why abusive relationships happen, and also really appreciate the author's note at the end because it was somewhat based on her personal observations and experiences. I'm giving this novel a solid 4. Next book was Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. This was kind of an absurd novel, and to quote the book, society is a factory and you're an alien. So it kind of gives you a little bit of the vibe. Some of the plot was definitely just really crazy and just too far away from life, but it makes me think about, again, how the societal values shape who you are. It almost gives me some of the similar feelings as when I was listening to The Vegetarian. And I'm rating this a 3. Next one was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. It was just the perfect escape book. It was whimsical, it was dramatic. It's a story about a mysterious night circus. This is a great book to read at night by a fire pit in the woods, and I am giving this a solid 4. I definitely want to read the physical book again. The next one was 101 Essays That Will Change the Way You Think by Brianna West. I'm just laughing at my notes here. I wrote, feels like 101 laundry list of things you should do to make your lives better. Some repetition, lots of common sense, and it didn't explain any idea in detail or with examples. The couple of things that I did remember to jot down in my notes was live with purpose instead of passion, because passion is desire for the emotional high, but purpose is logical and will get you to your dream. Overall, I gave this a 2 because I genuinely just don't remember many of the points. But maybe it's a book that you can just read a couple of essays once in a while. I feel like it's not a book that you want to binge listen or binge read in one session because it just felt like a lot of big talk buzzwords. The next book was Electra by Jennifer Saint. So I am not familiar with Greek mythology, so I didn't get soaked into the story right away. I love the writing, but it wasn't the type of novel that I'm just personally drawn to, just because I couldn't relate to any part of the novel. So I'm giving this one a 2. Then I listened to Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. It really made me think about how much nurture really shaped the way you are. It also talked about the concept of loss, of helplessness. I would definitely recommend you reading it, and I give it a 4. The next novel is Counterfeit by Kristen Chen. I genuinely don't remember what the plot twist was, but I remember the plot twist being so good. I literally wrote OMG the plot twist, and I didn't write what the plot twist was. I immediately rated this a 4. The story makes you think about how morale can be twisted and reality could shape your morality. And I read Book Lovers by Emily Henry. I'm laughing at my notes again because what I wrote was, realize I just don't like romance novels, or if I want to read one, I prefer reading the physical books over listening, as things sound more cringy when listening. And somehow the protagonists, especially guys, are always good looking no matter what other issues they have. And the climax was also a bit underwhelming. So that was a 1. And let's just forget about that. Guest List by Lucy Foley. This is what got me into Lucy Foley. And I listened to a bunch of her other books afterwards. Husband and I listened to the entire book on a very long road trip drive. And it was just the perfect book to get through 8 hours of driving. It was basically a wedding that's happening on an island, but every guest has their secret and everything came together at the end. I definitely felt like the way she wrote the novel really made me feel like I was in the setting. I was on the island with these guests, kind of peeking into each of their secrets. It was so good. I give it a 4. And I immediately listened to The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley as well. I love the character building as well, but maybe because I listened to the guest list first, I kind of could anticipate her writing style, so it wasn't as mind-blowing as Guest List to me was. So I'm rating this a 3 because I feel like the guest list had a more unexpected plot twist than The Paris Apartment. And I listened to A Promised Land by Barack Obama. This was probably the longest book that I listened. I'm pretty sure it was the longest book that I listened to all year. It was 29 hours, I remember. By the way, I also listened to all of my audiobook on at least 1.5, sometimes 2 times speed, just because I can't stand like really slow talking. Even though I don't personally talk that fast, I like to listen to books that's really fast so that I feel like I'm really, pacing through the book. It's just very hard for me to imagine what goes into a president's head when all we hear about is probably like 1%, maybe 0.1% of what's actually happening. That was a really just fascinating peek into the life that I will never, ever live. But I definitely feel like it was too long. For someone who's not into politics, it is probably a bit too much detail and just feel like a laundry list. But then for someone who is actually into politics, they probably already have heard of a lot of the things he talked about on the news or in their own research readings. Apologies for the lighting change. But continuing with our book list, the 44th book that I listened to was The People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry. Another romance novel. I mentioned that I'm not a big romance novel fan, and the reason I didn't like this book was most of the book was kind of describing the friendship between the girl Poppy and the guy Alex, but it was also very obvious that they were, just teasing each other. So like, why do you call it friendship if it's like very clearly they're flirting with each other? Apologies if you're a romance novel lover, but I am rating this book a 1. The next novel was The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley, and I did really enjoy this. Just another murder mystery, page turner. It involved twisted friendships, relationships, everyone's a suspect kind of story. I also just really love how she developed her characters. It just felt like everybody just all came to life, even though she didn't, give you the full context of the entire life of each character. So I just really love Lucy Foley's writing style. And for this one, I'm rating this a 3. The next book was East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Now, obviously a masterpiece. It's a very famous novel. Very long. It was only slightly shorter than Obama's book. So it did take me quite a few days to kind of finish listening to it, even on 2 times speed. And the kind of overarching idea is you should be the owner of your life. You can choose your own fate. I feel like it was a good dramatic story, but it definitely felt a little bit too slow at times. So for that reason, I'm rating this a 3. It's still a really good book. It's just I wish it's a little more concise. The next one was a very short one. It was the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Basically, a man waking up realizing that he turned into a giant bug. It was kind of like a very cold, objective way of telling the story. It really made me think about kind of what is the essence of my existing, the mind, the body, the combination, and is this based on my relationship with others or relationship with self? Really big topics that this book make you think about, even though it's a very, very short story. And I'm rating this a 3. Next one is another of my book club books, and it's Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis. It's just a really feel-good novel. I really rooted for her as she overcame the sexism, discriminative opinions on her. I think everybody would take away something from the novel, and it's also like a really entertaining read as well. The next book was Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I don't know if it's due to the story happening post World War I or it just touched upon too many big topics like war versus peace, social class, or soul. I just could not get into the story. I enjoy novels when there are some twists or some just dramatic things happening. So unfortunately, it's just not my preferred writing style. I'm rating this one a 1. The next one is The Book of Lost and Found by Lucy Foley again. It is not the kind of murder mystery thriller type of book. Basically described the protagonist Kate's adventure of kind of tracing back a painting or the identity of the woman in a painting. The setting, the way she describes and develops her characters just really drew my attention. So I'm rating this one a 3. The next book was It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey. Now at this point, I do not know why I continue to listen to these romance novels thinking that one would blow my mind, because again, I rated this one a 1. What I wrote down was, do we really need a rich spoiled girl plus sex boat captain love story? I actually get furious even just thinking about the premise. And at one point, there was just very detailed description of them having sex, and the protagonist felt like what she enjoyed so much after having sex was the deep emotional connection, even though the emphasis of the writing was definitely on the sex part. So it was just not getting the idea across. And the best part is this captain obviously is like tall and muscly and handsome and also super rich. It was just too many layers of unrelatableness that rubbed me the wrong way. Another novel, however, quite a masterpiece, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Dare I say that I kind of wish this book was a bit shorter. The paradoxical situation that this book tried to describe was very much well explained with a few of the scenarios. I felt like at times it just seemed a little bit repetitive. Like, okay, I get the idea. Catch-22 tend to be related to abusive of power, social norms, expectations. I'm giving this a 3. It's still a good book, but I probably won't read it again. The next book is If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha. Now, this is a book about 4 Korean women and their journeys living in a society where the appearances matter a lot. And I've definitely heard my Korean friends or even just seeing on news TV shows about how plastic surgery is such a common thing to do. People even give out plastic surgeries as graduation gifts to their kids. And this book kind of made me realize what was the root cause of that. It wasn't as much as, oh, we just all want to look pretty, but it was rooted in the imbalances of social class, of genders. I want to reread this book, just the physical book, so it's a little bit easier to follow the 4 different protagonists' journey. By listening to it, I feel like sometimes I just lose track of who's who, but it is still a really, really good book, so I'm rating this a 3. The next book was Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason. Now, this was a little bit of a surprise to me. I didn't think I enjoyed the book as much as I did. It was more of a sorrow, sad story than a happy story, even though the ending did feel very hopeful to me. It's basically about a woman's journey with this mysterious mental illness. After reading the story, it really made me appreciate all the love that I've received from friends, from family, even in invisible ways. I think it's a fantastic novel, so I'm rating this a 4. Next book was another Lucy Foley one, The Invitation. Now, this one, I only rated this a 2 because it was a little bit too slow and it just didn't feel, I don't know, mysterious enough for me. I think it was about a story of people on a boat or something. I can't even remember the exact plot, but I do remember at the time when I was listening to this book, I was watching the Netflix series 1899, which really sad that they're no longer releasing season 2 because that Netflix show was so good. It was also a story related to a boat, so I feel like my mind was just jumping between the 2 boats, and clearly one boat was a lot better than the other. The next one was The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, a classic dystopian novel. I think she did a great job really kind of portraying this world. I wish there was a little bit more character development of not just the handmaid herself, but also I think there was a commander and there were some two other guys. I just kind of wish I knew a little bit more context of those characters. And also, my husband and I listened to the audiobook on an 8-hour drive. And I'll be honest, I definitely fell asleep at least a couple of times. So I may or may not have missed certain plots of the story, but it also showed you that maybe it wasn't like a gripping enough story for me to stay awake for the entire ride. I'm gonna rate it a 3 for now. I feel like after I watch the show, maybe I'll appreciate the book a little bit more. Harry Soto is Back by TJR. I think this was the 3rd TJR novel that I read last year. I really like the father-daughter dynamic, but the protagonist herself, basically a tennis player who is just very impatient and she's very much dead set on winning. It almost felt at times a little bit too one-dimensional and there wasn't much depth to the character. So I'm rating this a 3. It was an entertaining read for sure. Then I read I'm Glad My Mom Died by Janet McCurdy. This book just instantly got so much hype. And I think for finally a good reason. It was well worth the hype. It was a crazy journey that she's gone through. I just really appreciate how honest she was when writing this book. The one line that stuck with me was acting is inherently fake and writing inherently authentic. I feel like that very much summarizes the feeling I get from this book. I'm rating this a 4. The next one was A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket. Whether you're 7 or 70, you will be entertained by this fabulous, witty, sometimes dark humor, but also really warming, sometimes very sad, actually many times very sad, but just a great novel. It's a children's novel, but I think adults could very easily enjoy it. And I recently rewatched the Netflix show A Series of Unfortunate Events, probably for like the 3rd time. The show definitely was based on the book series, but they also added in more plots and they basically added more connection to different parts of the novel. I do feel like the show was even more impressive than the book series. I'm rating this a 5. If you have not heard of it, read it already, you should definitely give it a read. If you have done so when you were young, read it again. I think you'll still be entertained. The last book of 2022 was Assembly by Natasha Brown. Very relevant and important writing. It was very short. It basically portrayed a Black woman's identity, her life living in the UK, and her interactions with her rich partner's family. The one line that really stuck with me was, always lived here, still never from here. As someone who moved cross countries, I can definitely resonate. There could be more kind of plot development to it, so just not my preferred style of writing, but I think the message is very important, so I'm giving this a 3. I used to be, when I was maybe 3 years old, a bookworm and stopped being a bookworm for a solid 2 decades. And here I am. I would love to open up the comment section for everyone to recommend one book that they feel like everybody should read. And I will see you in one of these ones. Bye!